So hello everyone, welcome to IO Associates' second virtual Java Meetup. Lovely to see loads and loads of familiar faces this evening and quite a few new ones as well. There's quite a few names I'm not recognising, so welcome. For those of you guys that don't know, my name's B. So hope you're all keeping safe and well and that lockdown's not driving you too mad. I know if you're anything like me, you'll be starting to struggle with sort of being shut in. But all jokes aside, I hope this evening is, kind of a bit of a breath of fresh air and a slight change to your usual Tuesday evening. Many of you will already know, but IO Associates are a tech and digital recruitment firm. So we specialise in placements across the UK. I've been at IO now for about 7 months and had our Java contract team. Actually lucky enough to work alongside Inness, who I'm sure would like to say hello.
Thanks a lot, B. Good evening, all. First of all, thanks a lot for joining us here tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Just like to hope that everyone and their families are keeping well and safe. Like B, I'm one of the seniors here at IO Associates, and I head up the permanent Java desk here, and I cover the Southwest region. It's a great honour. It's a massive pleasure to bring you our second virtual meetup on Zoom. And we're very lucky to have Matt with us here again, albeit this time virtually and not in Bristol. Before I explain the format of the evening, Matt, would you like to just say a few words just to introduce yourself and the talk that you'll be doing for us later on?
Yeah, so my name is Matt Raible. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'll be talking about JHipster and how it allows you to create microservices.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I'm sure we're all Zoom experts from now, but you should have a chat function at the bottom of your screen. So throughout the talk, you're invited and please feel free to ask any questions that you may have during the presentation, and B and I will effectively interject Matt during the talk with those questions. At the end of the talk, there'll be some time for any further questions or further discussions. There'll be a sort of Q&A section at the end. There'll be a few polls as well, so do watch out for those as well. So without further ado, over to you, Matt.
All right. So let me start by sharing my screen here. Hopefully this is the right one. And then boom. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah? All right. So what I would encourage you to do is during this talk, like I said, you can put it in the chat, but if there's something that's really pressing, I would like this to be somewhat like a meetup where if you have the ability to unmute and just say something, feel free. At the very least, put your question in the chat so we can get to it at some point, because if you think of a question and you want to hold it to the end, then we might not get it answered. So that's why I encourage you to ask it early. So to begin, I'm going to ask a question here. Do you use a microservices architecture? And so I'll be asking those throughout, but I'll get started while you're answering that one. So this is microservices for the masses. The reason I say for the masses is because with JHipster, it makes it so easy that pretty much anyone can do it, even someone that's not a programmer per se, but the difficulty is they still have to install the tools to create a JHipster app, right? So it's not terribly easy, but it's not too hard either. So my name is Matt Raible. Come on, slides. There we go. And we'll be talking about an introduction to microservices, just an overview. I'm sure most of you know what it is by now, but I like to briefly cover it. Microservices with JHipster, deploying a JHipster app and a microservices architecture to the cloud, and then what's on the roadmap for JHipster. Like I said, Matt Raible, I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity and no running water, and I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and it felt like it was uphill both ways. But in the winter we got to ski, so that was pretty fun. And I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife Trish and my 2 lovely children. Abby and Jack. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. He's a 1966 Volkswagen bus that I bought off eBay in 2004. Spent 13 years restoring him. And part of the problem was those Porsche wheels aren't the only thing that's Porsche in it. It's also got a Porsche 911 engine and a Porsche 915 transmission. So it really gets up and goes. I work for a company called Okta. My dad likes to say Okra, so that's the wrong term. But Okta actually means a unit of cloud measurement. It's a meteorological term. And if it's an 8 octa day, it means it's very cloudy. I think the most octas you can get is like 9, and that's like thunderstorm kind of weather. But 0 octas means it's bright and sunny and there's not a cloud in the sky. So now I'd like to know a little bit more about you. First of all, let me share the results here from the first poll. So it looks like the majority of people are using microservices, but it's not overwhelming, right? We have 54% using, 46% not using. And then let me see, I need to launch another poll here to find out a little more about you. Okay, pardon, it's one of the first times I've done polls on Zoom. So what version of Java are you using? So we've got Java 8, Java 11, and Java 12 plus. I'm gonna guess most people are on Java 8. And that's what it's looking like. We got 92% voted. So I'll go ahead and end it there. 68% are using Java 8, 22% with Java 11, and 11% Java 12 and up. So that's interesting. It's not too out of the ordinary. A lot of companies have had a hard time migrating to Java 11, and they really haven't seen a lot for it. The cool thing about JHipster is it works with all versions, all the way back to Java 8, all the way to Java 14. Okay, so another question here. Number 3, what Java frameworks are you using? So this is mostly backend frameworks because we don't use a lot of front-end Java frameworks anymore. But Spring, MicroProfile, that's what Quarkus implements, and Micronaut. So just trying to get a feel for that from the audience. So we have 97% so far using Spring. One person's using Micronaut, no Quarkus folks. So I'll go ahead and share that out. And then let's see, I got one more. What's your favorite JVM language? So we have Java, Kotlin, Groovy, Scala, Clojure. Scala and Clojure were huge 5 years ago. Not so much now. Kotlin seems to be kind of taking over. And Groovy is very popular for tests. A lot of my coworkers, whenever they write libraries, they use Groovy for tests because one of the nicest things is you don't even need reflection to access like private variables. You can just do it. Okay, so we got 88% that voted there. 90, I'll go ahead and stop it. Looks like most people are using Java. We've got a few Kotlin folks and one Groovy, one Scala, no one Clojure. That doesn't really surprise me. All right, so share those results. And now we'll get on with the presentation. So, history of microservices, and let me, I was gonna hide the Zoom stuff, but I think it'll be fine. Maybe if I just get rid of all the faces, there we go. So I'm gonna talk about the history of microservices, microservices architectural philosophy, why you might wanna use microservices, and then I'll show you code for a demo with a microservices architecture with Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. So according to Wikipedia, the term microservice actually isn't that new. It was first used as a common architectural style to describe, how different components would fit together way back in May of 2011. But even before that, Dr. Peter Rogers introduced the term micro web services during a presentation at Cloud Computing Expo in 2005. And then in 2007, Yuval Lowry mentioned it as part of the evolution of Microsoft's architecture in 2007. So he said services are composed using Unix-like pipelines. The web meets Unix, true loose coupling, And services can call services. There can be multiple language runtimes, and complex service assemblies are abstracted behind simple URI interface. Any service at any granularity can be exposed. So that sounds a lot similar to what we have today. And this was talked about, way back in 2007. And so that's the real history. But the history that we tend to know in the Java space comes from these four guys: James Lewis up on the top left there, Martin Fowler on the top right, Adrian Cockcroft down in the bottom left, and Joe Walnes. And so a lot of the ideas from their writings and their thoughts are what we know as microservices today. And Adrian Cockcroft, who was at Netflix at the time, described the architecture as fine-grained SOA. So, it's kind of a reinvention of the wheel. We used to call it SOA, now it's microservices. And he pioneered the style at web scale, as did Joe Walnes, Dan North, and a couple other guys. So Martin Fowler and James Lewis, the two top guys, wrote an article titled simply Microservices on March 25th, 2014. And years later, we're now 6 years later, this is still considered the definitive article that really kicked off the microservices movement. And so traditionally, technology, especially among organizations, has been organized by a team. You have UI specialists, you have middleware specialists, you have DBAs, you have production people, you have people that monitor production or deploy to production, and it's very siloed functional teams. And so because of that, it leads to very siloed application architectures. And what happens is someone on the UI team, for instance, if they need something done from the middleware team or the DBAs, a lot of times it'll take so long to get them to add a feature that they need that they'll do something in the UI that makes it possible. Same thing with the middleware people. They'll do things that they have control over in their environment rather than delegating to other teams. So the smart team, optimizes around that separation and then forces the logic into whatever application they have access to. So it's an example of Conway's Law in action. And so Conway's Law says any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So with microservices, the whole philosophy is do one thing and do it well. And so it's very difficult if you have an organization that has siloed teams to adopt microservices, because the whole philosophy of microservices is you have one thing that a team works on all the way from designing it to developing it to putting it in production and monitoring it. So very few companies work like that. And so that's why you need to actually restructure your company before you can successfully adopt microservices. Everything should be a team that has full autonomy of that microservices. So in Martin Fowler's article, he says you shouldn't start with a microservices architecture. Instead, begin with a monolith, keep it modular, and split it into microservices once the monolith becomes a problem. So you can do this with asynchronous messaging. Instead of calling interfaces or classes directly, you can use asynchronous messaging within a monolith. There's also a project from the Spring folks called Modulith that allows you to use annotations on your classes to actually indicate that you don't want type coupling in there. So that's the best approach, is to start with a monolith, don't adopt microservices right away. However, if you have a monolith and you want to migrate to microservices, you should definitely check out Spring Boot. So if you're already using Spring, migrating to Spring Boot is usually not too difficult. I've done it in a day before on a project. A company that I worked for before Okta was called Stormpath. They did it in 3 weeks, and that was their whole platform as a service architecture. And that was a large code base, over 1 million lines of code. So I don't think it's terribly difficult if you're using Spring to migrate to Spring Boot. And Spring Boot 2.0 added two things, or added one thing. It added reactive stack. So they already had the servlet stack with Spring MVC, and they added the ability to do reactive programming with Netty, Servlet 3.1 containers, and Spring Webflux, as well as all the reactive repositories from Spring Data. So if you're going to get started with Spring Boot, start.spring.io is one of the best places on the internet, not only because it looks good, but also because you're starting something new. Even if it's just a demo that you want to show your colleagues, or you're speaking at a conference, it's a great place to be. You're not working on legacy code, right? It's kind of fun to develop new apps. So this is what it looks like. Oh wait, this is the old one. This is what it looks like. Oh wait, that's the old one. This is what it looks like. They've gone through a bunch of revisions lately. So this is the latest and greatest. And you can see this was Spring 2.1, Spring Boot 2.1. This is 2.2.5, and now 2.3. So maybe with 2.4, they'll give us another reskinning. But up on the top right there, you can get dark mode, which I know a lot of people like. And you just type in your dependencies and you can generate an app. Or you can hit the Explore button and see what is going to be in that app. So that's all pretty neat. So in this demo, usually what I do is I actually create apps and I show it all working. But what I realized was I have 2 demos or 3 demos in this talk. And I didn't want to have a high rate of failure. And so I figured it was easier to just show the code for the first demo. And then you could obviously copy and paste it and it would all work. And that repo at the bottom there has all of the code in it. And then the second one, the JHipster ones, I'll dig in and write the code and do all live coding for that. So to create, in this demo, what I'll show you is how to create a service registry. And so we'll use Netflix, Eureka for that. And then you'll have a gateway app, and that's kind of your UI or entry point into your microservices architecture. And then a catalog service. And that catalog service just has some data in it. You know, it's pretty simple. And we'll create an endpoint in the catalog service. We'll create a filtered endpoint in the gateway. We'll show some failover capabilities. And then the Spring Security OAuth stuff, I'm not going to show you, but you can dig into the repo and see it. I got a blog post that I'll give to you that you can look at as well. And the reason I mention that is because Spring Security's OAuth support is what's in JHipster. And this bare bones example shows how to do it, and it's only like 10 lines of code. And the same thing exists in JHipster. So we haven't done really anything on top of, you know, the OAuth the support that Spring Security provides. We're just, you know, making it all work and using it. So you can create a Java Microservices architecture using start.spring.io. This is a command you can use to develop that discovery service or that Eureka service. The command I'm using is HTTP. That's from the HTTPy project. So httpi.org, you can get it. And it's just like curl, but it's way better. So if you're used to using curl and you know that well, you already know HTTPy. It uses application JSON by default, and it just works a lot better as a CLI. You don't have to use JQ to see your JSON or anything. It does all that for you. So in this example, I'm using Java version 11, but you could use Java 8, and that would all work as well. And it's setting the discovery service to be the base directory, and then it's basically untarring it. So it'll create that directory and put everything in it. And then you can open that up, and you'll need to add an enable Eureka server to make it the Eureka server. And then you'll need to configure a couple properties. So the port is 8761. That's just a convention. It's not mandatory. But Spring Boot uses 8080 by default. So the idea here is that you don't want to conflict with 8080. And most people use 8761. So that's just a convention. And then you want to tell it don't register with yourself because infinite loop, don't want that. And then I'll create a car service. So this is again hitting that same starter.zip endpoint. And it's grabbing a few dependencies: actuator, Cloud Eureka, that's the client to talk to Netflix, Data JPA, H2, Data REST, Web, DevTools, and Lombok. And so then I put that in a car service directory. And then in that car service, to enable the discovery so it can talk to that Eureka server, you have to do enable discovery client and specify the application name. The server port, you probably want 8080 for your gateway. So that's why I have 8090 here for this backend microservice application. And then the last one is the API gateway. And in there I have Cloud Eureka, Cloud Feign, which is an HTTP client to talk between microservices, Data REST, Web, Cloud Hystrix, which is for failover, and then Lombok just so I don't have to write getters and setters. And so again, you have to go into that project and enable the discovery client and then specify the Spring application name. And so then the name is used to communicate between microservices rather than an IP address or a DNS name. It just uses that logical API gateway or car service. So then we can build a REST API in the car service. This is the entity for a car. I just have a simple ID and a name. And I use Lombok to say, you know, it's a data class that adds like toString and hash code and all that. No args constructor, which means, you know, it'll work with JPA and an entity annotation for JPA. And then I can use a repository REST resource, which is basically a way of exposing your anemic domain model on the web. It works awesome, but according to ThoughtWorks Radar, it's not exactly recommended because you're just taking your data entities and exposing them on the web. So it's great for demos like this, but in the real world, probably don't want to do it much. But the cool thing is, you know, this is 2-3 lines of code, and you have full CRUD API for your car entity. So then we can add some default data in there. So this would be a bean that we would just have in our car application class. And you'll see here on init, it'll go and stream a bunch of cars and put them in the database and then print them out. So it's adding a Ferrari and a Jaguar and Porsche and some lesser great ones like a Triumph and a Ford Pinto. And then to consume that car service or that API in the gateway, you have to add a whole bunch of enable annotations. So it's Feign clients to do that HTTP communication, circuit breaker to do the failover, discovery client that's to talk to Eureka, and then obviously just regular old Spring Boot. You'll have to create a client version of the car. So that's using the data class there and just the name itself. And you can see our Feign client will talk to that car service. It'll talk to the car's endpoint. And it has cross origin on there in case we wanted to slap like a Angular or a React client on this and it's running on a different port. And then it'll read from those cars. And then you could have a REST controller in your API gateway that basically takes that car client from Feign and puts it into a dependency. And then it can go through and actually read the cars, stream them, and filter out the ones that aren't cool. So the fallback method at the top there is controlled by the Hystrix command. So you'll see that Hystrix command annotation that says, hey, if I can't actually talk to the car service for some reason, just return an empty array list. So one of the philosophies with microservices is you should design to fail. So if anything happens, it doesn't bring down the whole system, just that one piece of functionality doesn't exist. And a real world application, that array list is probably not empty. Maybe it has a few defaults in there or something like that. And then, you know, it's able to conduct the logic. So we have a cool cars endpoint that you can talk to actually get those cool cars and filter out the ones that aren't so cool. And then the is cool logic, I just took out the ones that aren't as cool, right? Pretty simple. And if you were to actually run this in an IDE and you didn't have Lombok installed, it would say car get name, like I don't understand that. So if you're running this in an IDE, you do need a Lombok plugin for Eclipse or IntelliJ or NetBeans or whatever you're using in order to get that to resolve correctly. And then you can start all your different services with MVNW, and you'll see this is what it looks like, that 8761, that Eureka server. And we see our API gateway connected and our car service connected at the bottom there. And then you could hit that cool cars endpoint.
Matt, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've got a question from Yaspal, and I hope I am pronouncing this correctly. Is Feign client a custom annotation?
No, it's from Spring. So they provide that with Spring Cloud Feign is the dependency that comes with.
Brilliant, thanks.
All right,
Hopefully
thank
that
you.
answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
So that whole demo is in this blog post, Java Microservices with Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. And there's a link at the bottom there if you wanted to read through it. And basically it has all those commands in it. You can run it, see how it works, and then it also shows how to add OAuth 2. And to add OAuth 2, really all you're doing is you're adding some Spring security dependencies, and then you're configuring your app to have an issuer, which is like the metadata endpoint for OAuth and OpenID Connect. And then you'll need to register your app like with Keycloak or Google or GitHub or Okta, and then you'll get a client ID and a client secret from that. And then you can configure all your microservices to use that same client ID and client secret so they can talk to each other. And that's how you secure it with OAuth. So in part 2, I'm going to talk about JHipster, right? That's why we're here, installing and using JHipster and some of their microservices features. And then I'll talk a bit about progressive web apps, because what you're trying to do with microservices is really be resilient. And so PWAs give you that ability in the browser. So people often ask, what is JHipster? It started as a generator that created Spring Boot and Angular apps. That was way back in 2014. And in fact, it started as like an Ant-based project. These Java developers needed a way to run Node, and they didn't want to use, Node to do it. So they wrote Ant tasks to do it. And over the years, that has graduated into Maven and Gradle plugins. So it's grown to be so much more since 2014. Now what we'd like to say is JHipster is a development platform to quickly generate, develop, and deploy modern web applications and microservice architectures. And the reason we say that is because it can not only generate like CI/CD pipelines, but can also deploy to a cloud provider, and it has the ability to deploy your test results to Sonar, has the ability to put everything into Docker. And so there's a lot of functionality there that's not just generating the actual application. And it's funny because if you think that is a mouthful, I actually wrote a whole paragraph that has all the technologies in JHipster, and I'm just going to read this really fast. So JHipster is a development platform to quickly generate, develop, and deploy modern web applications, microservices architectures, right? That's what we say right there. But we support many front-end technologies, including Angular, React, and Vue. We even have mobile app support for Ionic and React Native. On the back end, we support Spring Boot with Java or Kotlin, Micronaut, Quarkus, Node.js, and .NET. For deployment, we embrace cloud-native principles with Docker and Kubernetes. Deployment support exists for AWS, Azure, Cloud Foundry, Google Cloud Platform, Heroku, and OpenShift. So that's a lot, right? We don't support all of those, as in individuals don't support everything. I typically work on Java and Kotlin, and I work on Ionic on the front end, and Angular, a bit of React, not so much Vue. So there's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of developers that help out with that. So we want more JHipsters. We want more contributors to the project, and we also want more logos. So if you happen to think of a cool logo that you want to add, there's an artwork repo there that you can go and contribute to. Just create a PR, and you might see it as one of our hipsters. So our goals, we have a number of them. We want to develop a high performance and robust Java server-side stack with excellent test coverage. So, you know, I said we have .NET and Node.js support, so maybe I should even take Java out of that first one, right? A sleek, modern, mobile-first UI with Angular, React, or Vue, and we use Bootstrap for CSS with all those frameworks. If you did want to use something like Angular Material, there is a module out there that you could use. It's called NGX-Hipster, but you won't get everything that JHipster has out of the box, but still it works well, and it's developed by one of the core contributors. It has a resilient microservice architecture with cloud-native principles and a powerful workflow to build your application with Webpack and Maven Gradle. And our whole goal there is that you don't really have to restart things. You basically start it once, you develop all day long, and it restarts when anything changes. So to use JHipster, you can use npm to install it, and then you'll create a new directory and CD into it. So as a Java developer, this is probably the hardest part for me, that's step 2. Most of the time I was familiar with Maven archetypes or other tools that would create a directory and then put it in there. But Yeoman has this concept of you create the directory, then you CD into it, and then you run the actual command. So we've done a lot of work to try to notify people that this is happening, because if you generate everything in your home directory, there's a bunch of dot files, and you're going to be like, man, why did this happen? So make sure and create a new directory and then CD into it. And then you just run it with the JHipster command. And so JHipster command by itself will prompt you for a number of different options. It'll say, do you want a monolith or a microservice? What framework do you want? Do you want Postgres or MySQL or Mongo? It'll ask all those different databases. So that's one way to do it. The other ways to do it are with a JDL file. So JHipster domain language will allow you to specify all the different options you want and then actually generate everything at once. So I think that's the easy way, and that's what I'll show you today because there's less choices. So for a microservices architecture with JHipster, this is what it'll look like. You'll have a gateway where your Angular application sits, or your React or your Vue. It'll have Zool for proxying. And if you wanted to use our new reactive support, then it'd use Spring Cloud Gateway there instead of Zool. JHipster registry is very much like the Eureka server, and it handles the registration and communication between the different microservices. And you can see microservice 1, 2, and 3. You can have different databases. You can, in theory, have different even backends. I haven't tried it, but should be possible. And then you can use JHipster console to monitor everything. We also have support for Prometheus, so those are 2 options there. And then this is the same diagram, but you know, with more logos. So you can use console if you want instead of JHipster registry. You can use session-based authentication. You can use JOT-based authentication, JWT, or OAuth and OpenID Connect, which those use JOTs as well. And there's also a JHipster UAA service. So that's built with Spring Security and its authorization service support. So it's kind of OAuth as well. So I wanted to talk about OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect just for a little bit, because that's what my company does, and that's what I'll be showing you with JHipster. So OAuth 2.0 was invented way back in like 2009, and it was kind of released in 2012. And the problem it wanted to solve was if you signed up for an account on LinkedIn or Yelp back in 2005, 2006, at the end of the flow of your sign up, it would prompt you with a username and password to your Gmail account or your Yahoo account or whatnot. And at the time, I think most of us probably just put it in, right? We knew it off the top of our head, so no big deal. And then LinkedIn would go out and get all of your contacts for that service and probably invite them, could call it spamming. And then they would say, we're not keeping your password, but is there any proof, right? In 6 months, they could, if you haven't changed your password, probably do it again and get your contact. So what they wanted was a better way, delegated authorization. That's where OAuth came in. And basically what it allows you to do is you go and log in to Google and give LinkedIn permission with an access token to talk to your Google contacts and get that information. So let me walk you through it here. This would be Yelp.com in a modern day scenario where they're using OAuth 2.0. And just so you know, OAuth 2.0 is only for authorization, has nothing to do with authentication. That's where OpenID Connect comes in. OpenID Connect provides identity. So in addition to an access token, which can just be a random set of characters, an OpenID Connect or an ID token has to be a JOT and it has users' information in there so you can identify who they are. So if you start on Yelp.com and instead of entering your credentials in there, you actually click on a button that says Connect with Google, you'll be the resource owner in that instance because you own your Google API or your Google contacts. And the client in this case is the app Yelp.com. And so you'll go to an authorization server and you'll specify where to come back to. So that's part of the code that you write that says, hey, once you're done, come back to Yelp and hit this callback component. And what that callback component typically does is like store the access token, maybe it does some additional processing. You'll pass in some scopes to say, I'm using OpenID and I want the user's profile. If you don't pass in the profile, you might only get like a username or something like that, or a random set of characters instead of an email address. So you hit the authorization server. If you're logged in, then you won't even see it. You'll just come back to your app. If you're not logged in, it'll prompt you to log in. It'll request consent. Can they access your public profile and contacts? You'll come back to that redirect URI with an authorization code. So this is defining authorization code flow, the gold standard of OAuth. There's 6 different flows, but this one's the most secure. And you'll use that authorization code to go back to the authorization server to get an access token and an ID token. And at this point, you could display the user's name if it has it in the ID token, but you can also go to what's called a user info endpoint that has like the full information about the user, like maybe what roles or groups they're in and things of that sort. So that's how modern day authentication works with OpenID Connect. So I mentioned that if you're going to start with JHipster, or if you're going to start with microservices, try a monolith first. So I have a couple examples here. One's on GitHub at JHipster 6 demo, and another one's 21 points that I wrote as part of the JHipster mini book. Both of those are open source. They're both on GitHub. And the one on the left actually has a YouTube video that you can go ahead and watch, and it's 15 minutes. It's also featured on the jhipster.tech main website, and you can see how to create a blog, which we'll do today, but we'll do it faster. So I want to mention progressive web apps. A lot of progressive web apps nomenclature comes from Chrome, Google, and Facebook, trying to figure out a way how to get a lot of people that don't have as great of phones or as great of connections on the internet. Because sometimes you'll buy a phone in, let's say, India or Africa, and it doesn't even have enough space on it to install a native app. Like it's got a web browser, and that's what progressive web apps are, right? They're just browser-based applications that look like a mobile app, and you can install them, but they don't take much space. So the 3 requirements for a PWA, a progressive web app, is it has to come from HTTPS, has to load while offline, and reference a web app manifest. So loading while offline is done by service workers, which is basically like a background proxy that can look at your HTTP requests and cache the data. So if it's already been there once, it can say, hey, it's unavailable, so just return what's cached. Or you can have it so it pulls from the cache first because the data doesn't change that much. So they can be installed on your mobile device, and that's what that web app manifest does. It has icons, the launch screen, colors, things like that. So they look and act like a native app, but they're distributed through the web, right? They don't have to go through an app store. And they're fast, right? Because they're caching a lot of stuff and they're just making requests for data when they need to. So a lot of this comes from Alex Russell in 2016 at the Chrome Developer Summit. he said, you know, we failed on mobile. And a lot of the reason for that is because our laptops are filthy liars. We're using these super fast laptops, we're on fast connections, and we're never really experiencing what people feel on a 3G connection. And so that was, you know, the initial launch of PWAs to be like, hey, if you can develop something that works well on a 3G connection, then people are really going to like your app. And what they found is that there was a DoubleClick report, and these numbers are actually higher now, but 53% of visits are abandoned if a mobile site takes longer than 3 seconds to load. And the same report said the average mobile site takes 19 seconds to load. I think I read in 2019 it was up to like 23. So you've seen it, right? If you're ever on a slower connection, it takes a long time to load. It's just terribly frustrating. You usually go and do something else. So to fight, you know, your laptop being a filthy liar, one of the things you can do is buy a cheap old Android phone. And you can also use Chrome developer tools to like throttle the network, throttle your CPU, and make it so you experience what those end users might feel. So to enable PWA in JHipster, in the microservices architecture, you might have a gateway. And so you can go into that main web app index.html and just uncomment this code. It's already there by default, so all you have to do is uncomment it. And to force HTTPS in Spring Boot, you can add something like this. That basically says if you're on like Heroku or Cloud Foundry where they have a load balancer in front of things, you look for this header and it knows to redirect to HTTPS. So I wrote a blog post on that 10 ways to secure Spring Boot, goes through all kinds of other techniques that you can use to secure your Spring Boot application. And most of them are actually in JHipster, so that's pretty neat. So now what I'll do is I'll create a microservices architecture with JHipster. I'll create a gateway. I'll create a store microservices app, which is just simple. It's like a product with a price and a name and an image. A blog microservices app, which is you know, a blog itself, the entries in a blog, and then tags. So there's one-to-many, there's many-to-many relationships in there, there's many-to-one from a blog back to a user. And then I'll show you how to convert that to be a PWA. Hopefully I remember that part. And then we'll run everything in Docker. So this is the real meat of the presentation here. So
we've got a quick question from Yashpal again. And the question is, how can we address the CORS?
Cross-origin resource sharing.
Yes.
So with CORS, how it works is Spring MVC and Spring Webflux provide a cross-origin annotation that you can use on all your REST endpoints. It works great until you get Spring Security in the mix. So as soon as you add Spring Security in the mix, what you need to do is you need to add a filter that configures it to happen a little sooner in the whole chain. So it happens before Spring Security. But if you're using JHipster, there's no need for CORS because it packages everything together. So your Angular app is inside your Spring Boot app. In development, though, you can develop them separately. And how that works is it proxies from Webpack or whatever process you're running for Angular to Spring Boot. So there's no CORS that happens there. There's no origin header that's sent. And so there's no CORS issues really with JHipster. But JHipster does have CORS configuration built in. So if you did need to open it up, maybe you have another client that's written in Ionic, runs on a web server somewhere else, you can do that. It's just a matter of configuring things.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Doesn't look like
right.
it at the moment.
Okay, so you can see I'm using the latest version of JHipster. This was just released yesterday, 6.9.0. And similar to start.spring.io, if I go to start.jhipster.tech, you could actually create it right here. I'm not going to create it right here, but I did want to show you some statistics. So this is kind of neat. In the last 24 hours, there's been quite a few applications generated. At one point, there was 90 in just an hour. But you can also see things like Angular versus React. Angular is still the most popular, probably because it's the default. But at one point, React, where that was none. So I think this is pretty popular too. With microservices, people don't have a UI, right? So that doesn't show up as one. And Maven versus Gradle, you can see that Maven's most popular, but I think that's also because it's the default. So there's some interesting stats there. But what I want to show you is designing entities. So JDL Studio, as I mentioned, we have a JHipster domain language. which allows you to model your whole application, your relationships between your entities. And so I have this microservices deployment here, or plus deployment. And so if I bump the fonts a little, you can see kind of the relationships between everything. This product microservice is its own, separate kind of microservice. And this blog one is its own separate microservice. And the gateway really only serves up the UI. And so it probably occurred to me 6 months ago that maybe we were doing it wrong, actually 9 months ago, because I started researching micro front ends. And what micro front ends do is they basically take it so the UI is with the microservice. And how we're doing it with JHipster is we have a monolith UI. And so if you change something in that backend microservice and it needs UI adjustments, then you do have to redeploy everything. So I am currently investigating micro front ends for JHipster. So in that case, the product microservice would also have the product UI, and it would be included into the gateway. And the cool thing about that is Webpack 5 has support for micro front ends like built in, where it can remotely load other applications and like compile them and everything. And it's called, I think, module federation. So similar to delegated authorization, identity federation, everything. They're calling it one of those cool, enterprisey terms. So module federation, Webpack 5, if you want to learn more about that. But this is my first application, right? This is my gateway. Anything that I don't define here will be the default that JHipster allows. So for instance, I don't have a development database defined. That means it's going to use H2 by default. Test frameworks, if I didn't have anything defined there, I wouldn't have any test frameworks. Authentication type is JWT by default. That will work with microservices. I'm using OAuth 2. Part of the reason for that is the JWT authentication that JHipster provides puts the access token in the client, stores it in local storage, and that works until you get marketing involved, and they might have some third-party scripts that can actually read your local storage. So not a huge thing to worry about, but OAuth 2 happens all on the server with Spring Security. They support storing the access token on the server. You never really have to worry about it on the client, and use this tried and true mechanism that we've been using for the last 20 years, which is called session cookies. Over here, we have a blog microservice. You can see application type is microservice. We're going to use Postgres in this one. We have to change the port so there's no conflicts. And then we have a store microservice. And this is the nature of using anything other than a SQL database, is you do have to specify all of the different ones, and you have to say enable hibernate cache as false. So the only way I learned this was by trying a JDL and running it and then getting errors. So you can do the same thing. The entities themselves are here. That's how they're defined with their, properties, types, validation rules. And then the relationships are down here. We have a many to one from blog to user. So a user can have many blogs. A blog can have many posts. Many to many is a post to tag, right? They can both relate to each other. And this right here, this syntax is basically saying, what value should I display in the dropdown when I'm establishing those relationships on the UI? So to me, this is much easier than, hibernate annotations or JPA annotations that you have to remember and try to get right. This will still generate them, but it's much simpler to just look at this rather than what they offer. And then pagination rules, some microservices stuff to say what goes with what. And then here's some options for Docker deploy and for Kubernetes right here. So if I were to download this, actually I can't really see it right there, download right here. That puts it in a JHipster JDL in my downloads directory. But I also wanted to show you another deployment here, and that was reactive microservices. So reactive microservices has been out since our 6.90 release, and we actually had support, I think, in 6.80, but it's much more full featured now. You can see in this example, the only difference is you say reactive equals true, and that will use Webflux instead of Spring MVC, and then you'll have to use a reactive database, for instance, Couchbase or Neo4j and MongoDB. I ran into some issues running this all in Docker Compose. That's why I'm not showing it. But hopefully we'll get those fixed. There'll be a 6.9.1 that'll fix that. Also, we have support for R2DBC coming. We already have it in JHipster, but it won't allow you to generate entities because unlike JPA, there's code and SQL that you have to write to manage relationships. So R2 DBC is like JDBC, where it's a little bit more low level, but allows you to use SQL databases with a reactive architecture. So now if I go and I'll create a new directory called apps and cd into it, and then I can do JHipster import JDL from that downloads directory, JHipster JDL.jh. And this will actually create all the applications at the same time. So in parallel, it'll create that gateway, it'll create that blog, and it'll create all the entities inside it. And the cool thing is, if you want to change any of your options, you could actually, for instance, go into the gateway. Put this up there a little. And what it generates is a yo.rc.json file. This is from Yeoman. Even though we don't use a whole lot of parts of Yeoman, we still do use this part. And it has all the answers from your questions, or the defaults if you didn't answer them in your JDL. So you can see the authentication type, the client framework, the base name, the build tool. So the cool thing is you can actually change any of the values here and rm-r your whole application. And what I've learned is rm-r actually doesn't delete dot files. So both this file will be retained and your entity files are stored in a .jhipster directory. So those won't be deleted either, and you can regenerate your whole application. So if you started with OAuth and you want to use JWT, now you can simply edit this file, delete everything else, and rerun it. And if you want to see the differences between them, the first time it'll check everything into Git, and the second time you can kind of compare, what changed between those. So that's certainly one way to do it. And we are thinking about, for JHipster 7, of making the source JDL instead of .yo.rc.json, but we haven't actually implemented anything along those lines yet. So you can see the biggest problem with this whole setup is npm install, right? Maven, people used to make fun of it because it downloaded the whole internet. But npm downloads the whole internet and invites all its friends. It's like, come on, it's a party. And if we actually ran, count lines of code, let's go into the gateway app, for instance. That's one that's got a lot of node modules, and you started doing count lines of code on it. It would go up into the millions, I believe. It's like, okay, node modules. Oh wait, must not done the install there yet. So this is a basic JHipster app without npm install done on it. And you can see there's mostly JSON. Well, the reason for that is translations and I18N. So that is the bulk of a JHipster app. When you choose it with the defaults, is it just has translation files in there. And then you'll see there's a lot of front-end code, TypeScript code, and there's a lot of back-end code. So, we're up to almost 20,000 lines of code. But again, most of it is in here. And we've been experimenting for the last couple of years with putting more of that code into libraries. In my app views experience, I used to give everyone all the source code. There was never any libraries that would be used. And people like that. And with JHipster, it's the same thing, right? You get all the source code, but there's a few classes we have in libraries. And what we've seen is no one really complained about that. So we might start putting more and more of this into libraries. And so there's a chance that you'll have a JHipster app that's just, a few hundred lines of code, but really it's all contained in other libraries that might be harder to customize, but we'll provide extension points.
Matt, can I come in with a question?
Yeah.
We've got a question from Yashpal. Is it possible to set up environment-related stuffs globally instead of inside each microservice in case something is in common or shareable?
Yes, and that's what I'll show you in this demo. So we'll use Spring Cloud configuration to configure all the different microservices. So JHipster registry has Spring Cloud config as part of it, a Spring Cloud config server, and all of the microservices talk to that server. So if you have any properties in your application.yml or properties file or whatnot, it can actually override those from a central location.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. So while that's going, we can start a few Docker containers. So if we go into Gateway and look at source main Docker, it created a few containers for us. So this app.yml is just for running the actual app itself in a Docker container. But there's JHipster registry that we're going to need to communicate between the microservices. And there's Keycloak, which we're going to need for the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. These other ones, Postgres is only needed for the production profile. And Sonar is only needed if you want to actually run the tests, right, against this and see what your code coverage is or whatnot. So I said I was going to turn this into a PWA, so let's do that. Source main web app index.html, look for service worker. There it is, so just uncomment that and then save it, and now should be a PWA. And I can start keycloak. So I have commands. I use omyzsh for my Z shell, and JHipster has a number of shortcuts that you can use. So I can just use JH keycloak up, and that'll actually start keycloak for me. So if I wanted to do alias JH keycloak up, you can see what that looks like. It's just running Docker compose. It's pointing to that file and it's saying start as a daemon and run it up. So I can also do J registry up. And then if I go into the store, that uses Mongo, right? It's not going to use H2 in development. It's going to use Mongo in development. So I'll do JH MongoDB, or is it Mongo up? Just Mongo up. So now all those Docker containers should be up. If we do Docker PS, we'll see Mongo, Keycloak, and JHipster registry running. And we could start the store because I think that one's done. This is the gateway, right? A lot of these applications finished running, but the gateway has to do that npm install. It has to compile all the TypeScript, which is funny that, you know, compiling TypeScript takes longer than compiling Java these days. So hopefully that's an optimization that'll happen in the future, or maybe people will start using something like, what's it, Dino? Dino is an alternative to Node written by one of the creators of Node, and that actually allows TypeScript natively, and so there isn't a compilation process that happens. But again, that's mostly server side once you're dealing with Node. So I can start up this store, and then I'll start up the blog as well. Hopefully the gateway will be done by then. And so there's a cool feature that we use for both Gradle and Maven. That is a default task or default goal. If you're typing npm Spring Boot run all day or Gradle boot run all day, you can actually go into your files and just specify that, hey, this is the default. And then all you have to write is like Maven or Gradle. It's pretty slick. So JHipster does that by default. That gateway sure is taking a while. npm, you're so slow. You could use Yarn. It might be a little faster, but what I've seen a lot of times is just by having Zoom running, it slows down my machine. So these demos can be a bit more painful. Next time I'll make sure and like run it ahead of time just to create the app at least. I can take some questions. Is there any questions you see there, Inness, that I could answer?
Nothing at the moment. So far, you've answered all of them.
All right.
Unless there's anyone, any questions now from the floor?
We're close. We got some starting going. Oh, the registry is not started. If you see this error on startup, trying to connect to that 8761, so that's the registry. So let me open another window and make sure that's going. So CD back to the gateway, JH registry up. And it shouldn't kill like the starting of the app. And the cool thing about having a reactive web application, if you're using WebFlex, your app will actually start without even having the database running, which is not a thing that Spring MVC handles gracefully, right? If it can't connect to your database, everything goes down. But the reactive support, it'll connect to that database after it's actually started up and do whatever logic it needs to do. So that's definitely pretty neat. So this gateway is almost done. That's the whole, microservices architecture, and it's also generating Kubernetes and Docker configuration for me. All right, and then it gives me all the instructions I need for that. So I'm going to keep that window because I might need those instructions. And I'll open another one for the gateway. And then I'll start that one up. And so if we were to go to 8761, localhost, that should be our JHipster registry. And we can sign in. It'll take us to Keycloak. And so this is one thing you'll need to do. Up here in the URL, it says Keycloak. And the reason for that is when you're running with Docker Compose or you're running in a lot of Docker configurations, it actually never expects you to like show the URL to the client. And so what I have to do is in my Etsy hosts, I have a 127001 registration for Keycloak. Because of how OAuth works, it redirects, right? And so it's going to redirect in the browser, and it's going to have that Keycloak there. And that's the only way we could figure it out, because there isn't really, even though we see localhost right here for Docker, there's not so much of a concept of localhost. So that's what I had to do to get that working. So now what it's doing is it's building that React project. And so it did the npm install, but what's happening here is it's using the Maven front end plugin to do another npm install and another build. So it's usually one of those things that only happens like the first time. And a lot of times it's actually pretty quick, but I have noticed, maybe I need a graphics card or whatever, that when there's Zoom sharing, things are a little slower. So this is just the instance is registered here, and there's some cool things in here. So you can look in the cloud configuration, right? It has the profiles that are currently under production, and it's got all of the different things that are configured. So it's just got a configure server name, and it's got a default zone setup, and it's got, a JWT secret. Now this isn't going to be used because I'm using OAuth, even with, JHipster registry. But the other thing that's cool is you can do encryption. So if you wanted to encrypt or decrypt properties, you could use it here, and so you wouldn't be storing raw values in your files. And then you could even SSH into the server if you wanted. And then administration-wise, you can see metrics for all the various applications. So this right now is JHipster registry, right? And it shows you, how your timings are on the different endpoints. But you could also say, well, I want to look at the store, right? And it's got that information. Oh, this is a bug that I found yesterday I forgot about. Now it's in an infinite loop. Can't get back. So there's another bug. So you can't switch between applications. It works fine for its own, but I'll have to kill that sucker. So I'll make sure, let me make a note so I remember to add that bug here. VI, JHipster bugs. We'll say registry, infinite loop for administering other microservices. Okay, and then we'll move that onto my desktop so I don't lose it. And if you think this is bad, it's taken a while, right? It's Angular 9 is part of the reason as well, where it does incremental compilation. So this stream of events won't happen as much the second time because it's already compiled those. Now, if you do an MVN clean or something like that, then it's certainly going to do that. But this is really, one of the most painful parts when using NPM or Node in general, that if you have, an impeded machine that's not as fast as it usually is, or you have a slow internet connection, well, things just take a while. One of the biggest mistakes I ever made was I was doing a presentation with Ray Sang at the Boulder Jug, which is just north of me about an hour. And we did this whole choose your own adventure with JHipster. And we started with, you can choose your web framework, you can choose, reactive or non-reactive, but you have to use, Docker, and you have to use Kubernetes because Ray was going to show it on Google Cloud. And so we actually went through a 90-minute presentation and never showed the app running. So I do realize I'm a whole hour in and I haven't showed the app running yet. So we're getting close to that, but hopefully this will get it going pretty quickly. I can show you this while we're waiting. So this is the Lighthouse report. After you've enabled PWA, I just did this about 20 minutes before we started this call. And you can see, so Lighthouse is a tool that you can use from Google. It's actually built into Chrome. So if you opened up your Chrome developer tools and looked at the audits tab, it would be in there and you could actually run a Lighthouse report. And so Lighthouse is very useful for testing the viability of a PWA. If you don't have a PWA, then that rightmost circle there isn't lit up. It's just all grayed out. They used to actually have a score. They used to say like 99 or 84 or whatever, but now they just say it's PWA or not. You can see the performance is very good. Accessibility is good. Best practices only gets an 86. And so I looked into that. And the reason for that is because we're not using HTTP 2, which is an option with Undertow in JHipster, but I think it's a profile that I have to enable. And then, so it says 3 requests are not served via HTTP 2. And there's some browser errors that were logged to the console. So at one point I figured out that if you actually logged into JHipster and then ran Lighthouse, it wouldn't log those errors, because the errors are just saying like 401 access denied. And so that's kind of neat that, you know, you can work around that. But our gateway is finally up and running. So we can go ahead and log in here, and it redirects it to Keycloak. You can see admin there. Now we're logged in, and then we could look at our entities. So there's our blog entities. And so what this is this is fake data. It's from a project called Faker.js. And so what we realized was a lot of developers were actually, you know, entering data to see if it worked, and it was kind of a pain. So we decided to, you know, allow fake data so you can just kind of play around with it. And you can turn it off. It's a liquid-based feature. Liquid-based we use to generate your schema for your app as well as upgrade between releases. And so you can go into one of the application configuration files and say, don't use Faker.js. But we could, you know, create a new one that's like admin's blog and relate it back to the admin user. There isn't one right now. There usually is. Let's try that again. So blog. So admin, and then just that system user. So you can see it got created there. We could go to a product, and this will use MongoDB. So we can say, I like beer. It's, you know, at least nighttime there in the UK, a little early here in the States. But you could add a picture to it, and it saves it, and you can tell it's MongoDB because of the funky ID there. And then it's got all of the gateway routes in here. You can see all the metrics, just like I showed you from the registry, and then health of all the various things, and auditing, and logs, and all that. So that's, you know, a JHipster app that's microservices in action. The last thing I wanted to show you is stopping all these and showing just how to configure it with Okta. So there's a couple other ones running here, and I'll just configure it and start it with Okta, and then we'll see if it's running at the end. So in the Docker Compose directory, there's Spring Cloud config, like I mentioned. Let me close these ones. And in this central server config is that configuration that's read by all of them. So if I looked at central server config and then application.yaml, you can see here's all the common configuration properties. So I can add a new one here about security. Let me look at my directory. I had like Okta Spring YAML. And so I already went and registered this app on Okta. And so I can just paste it in here and make sure my YAML's indented right. And so what this is configuring Spring Security to say, hey, the issuer is on Okta, and the client ID and client secret are, you know, these values that got created. So the cool thing here is I actually don't have to change any code anywhere. And if you had GitHub or you had Facebook or another identity provider, that's all you would have to change. And everything in JHipster will work as long as they're a proper OpenID Connect implementation. So now what I can do is Docker Compose up. And what this will do is it'll start all the various services. So if we look in here, it's got JHipster console and registry. Console's for monitoring. Registry, you've seen that in action before. And the rest of it pulls from those other projects. So one of the things we do have to do is we have to build Docker containers for them all before Docker Compose can run them. So back on this slide, I have the command. So it's mvn package with the prod profile. And I like to skip the test because that's going to take longer if we don't. And then blog. And when you first run the Docker Compose generator, it does spit out this command. I just got rid of it at one point. So I know that's going to take a bit. I'll come back in a minute and run the Docker up command. So JHipster also has many options for deploying to the cloud. You can use Heroku, you can use Cloud Foundry, AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. So for monoliths with Heroku, all you have to run is JHipster Heroku. And we've got some cool things in there where it detects if you're using Elasticsearch, and it'll configure an Elasticsearch add-on. If you're using Postgres or MySQL, it'll configure that in Heroku for you. So you will have to have a Heroku account. You will have to log in using the Heroku CLI, but everything after that's handled by JHipster. And if you want to deploy your microservices architecture, you could go to the JHipster registry on GitHub, and there's a button that just says deploy to Heroku. So you click on that, and it'll deploy the JHipster registry to Heroku, and then you can build and deploy your microservices similarly to how you do the monolith, right? You see the unit of microservices, you're on JHipster Heroku. It prompts you, I think, for the password for your registry, which you set up in the beginning, and then that's how it communicates between everything. So Julian Dubois, one of the founders of JHipster, wrote that blog post at the link there, and you can see how you can deploy microservices to Heroku. It's not you can't do everything at once, but you can certainly do them one at a time. And then for monoliths with Cloud Foundry, it's very similar. The only database we support is Postgres there. And most of the reason for that is there hasn't been a whole lot of interest in adding other databases, so no one's done the work. But if you, for some reason, wanted to support another database on Cloud Foundry, it probably wouldn't be too hard to add. And so for microservices, very similar to Heroku, where you'll need to deploy that registry, or you could probably use Cloud Foundry's registry, because I do believe they have one built in, and then you deploy your microservices and gateways independently. For Elastic container on AWS, you can use an AWS subgenerator. So you just type JHipster AWS containers. You'll probably have to be logged into AWS for that. I haven't tried it. You can also use Elastic Beanstalk and Box Views. So those are all supported on AWS. And then you can also use Google Cloud Platform just with your Docker containers. So that's what the jib command up there at the top is. It'll build your Docker containers just like I did for this demo. And then you can run JHipster Kubernetes to generate all your Kubernetes files. And then you just run the kubectl apply command, and it deploys everything as long as you set up your Kubernetes cluster properly. And so that's been the biggest difficulty for me when trying to deploy to Kubernetes on Google Cloud, is just creating that cluster initially and then configuring my gcloud CLI to actually talk to it. And JHipster does everything else for you. So if you wanted to see how it works, there's a blog post I wrote way back in 2017. And someone recently commented on it and said, hey, it still works, at JHipster 6. So that's pretty cool that 3 years later, it's like JHipster 4 app still works with JHipster 6. So let's look back at our things. We're still building the Docker container here for a gateway. Man, that gateway is just giving me fits. But the store is done. So we'll wait for that guy to go. And so part 4, the JHipster roadmap, what you learned and what's next for JHipster. So you learned about microservices. Don't use them by default. Try to use Monolith first. JHipster, obviously we have some cool icons there. Spring Cloud is what we leverage for a lot of our microservices with Spring Boot. Works great. And a lot of times what we find is we end up deleting code that we had for a workaround as new Spring Cloud releases are done. So they've done a great job. And with Spring Cloud Gateway, I did the implementation for that myself. And the OAuth support is like a one-liner. You have to add a token relay filter that'll take the access token and relay it between microservices, and that's beautiful. And a lot of people say, like, shouldn't my microservices like have server-server communication? And yes, that'll work, but if you want any user information, then passing that access token from your gateway down to your downstream microservice will have that access token that's tied to the user. And so then you could talk to that user info endpoint and get information about the user, which can be handy. I remember way back when I started with Spring Security, like the security context holder and the ability to get the user's information way down in like a DAO was super cool, that you didn't have to like pass it through method parameters or anything like that. So our gateway is done here. So we can go back to Docker Compose, and then we'll run Docker Compose up. And you could do -D, but I'm just gonna do it like this because I like to see all of the things running. Oh wait, let's make sure there's no Docker containers running. D-stop. Because we did start some before, so we don't want to have those running. Then Docker PS, make sure nothing's running. So Docker compose up. And I do believe that it would be fine. It would just not start those if they're already running, but better safe than sorry. So back to the presentation. Hopefully we'll come back to that at the end. It'll be working. If you want to see everything that I did in a blog post, then this blog post shows you how to do all that. Spring Cloud config, configure it to use Okta. And there's also a video in there. So if you want, a 12-minute video instead of this hour and 20-minute one, then that'll work. I did a Pluralsight course on this. It's kind of dated now, but it's 3 hours if you really want to go in depth. And it's a nice conversation between me and Michael Hoffman. So it's not just, a boring teacher. He asks some pretty cool questions. So what's next for JHipster? Spring Boot 2.3 is on the horizon. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was just released a couple of days ago. It has Docker image building built in. So that's pretty slick. That's one of the major features I've seen. We want to make sure that we have entity generation support with R2DBC. So that's in progress. There's a PR out there that we're working on right now. Not all the tests passed. That's why I didn't go into the release. And then personally, I'm interested in GraphQL support. There's several Spring Boot plugins that make it so GraphQL works really nicely with JPA. And then micro front ends, like I talked about, that Webpack 5 module federation support I think is pretty neat. So I hope to work on that this summer. And I also wrote a blog post on reactive microservices with Spring Cloud Gateway. This is what I use to actually figure out how to do it all. And then I put it into JHipster and works with OAuth, and it works really nice. I also wrote a book on JHipster. I like it so much. So it's now on version 5. We skipped version 3 because that was the hip thing to do, right? Angular did it, so we did it too. It's written in ASCII Doctor. InfoQ thought it'd be their most expensive book ever produced because they thought I would give them a PDF and then they would have to take it and make it work in mobile and all this print, all that kind of stuff. Turns out ASCII Doctor can do all that for you. So it's the cheapest book they've ever published. And quick and to the point, 164 pages. I developed this real world 21 points app with it where I track my health, just like Spring Boot tracks its health with Actuator. 21 points, I track whether I eat well, whether I am responsible with alcohol, and whether I exercise. So the goal is 21 points in a week. I usually aim for 15 to 18. I've noticed that if I get below 15 a week, so you get 3 points a day. You get a point for eating well, you get a point for exercise, you get a point for not drinking. And so if I get 15 points in a week, I pretty much maintain my health. If I get like 18 points or 19 points a week, I'm losing weight. And if I get like 12 or under, I get sick. And so it's fun because I stopped blaming my kids for bringing stuff home from school. I'm like, well, I haven't been healthy, so it's actually my fault. So if you want, you can buy it if you like the old-fashioned books, or you can download it for free from InfoQ. And I created a template for ASCII Doctor. So if you want to write your own mini book or just self-publish a book, that's all out there as well. You can just Google for InfoQ mini book, and it's under my name. So you can learn more about Spring Boot with their guides. You can learn more about JHipster on our website and Okta's APIs on developer.okta.com. We write a lot of blog posts on our Okta developer blog, and you can follow my team on Twitter at OktaDev. We mostly just post security information and tutorials that we post to our blog that cover most of the major frameworks, as well as how to integrate those with OpenID Connect. So my action today is try JHipster. If you just want to do a monolith, this is a great blog post that I wrote last year with JHipster 6. Should still work. It uses Java 12, but you don't have to. You could use Java 8 and that would work. And just shows how to get started with JHipster. And all of the source for everything I showed today is on GitHub, both the Spring Cloud Spring Boot, JHipster with Spring Cloud Config, and the Spring Cloud Gateway project. So let's go back and see if things are running. Localhost 8080. Looks like our gateway's up. And then I'm going to make sure and run this in an incognito window because we did log in with Keycloak and we do have a PWA enabled. So this is something very interesting, right? I'm glad I got to show you this. So a PWA, right, caches everything in the browser. So we're looking at this and everything's cached, right? So it's great if we're offline or we're reading a news article or whatever. But as a developer, like this is such a pain, right? We spend most of our lives trying to get our browser not to cache stuff. So the secret here is if you have it as a PWA, it will cache everything. So I'm going to open up my developer console and just show you, if you were opening this up, you would see there's some issues. But under application, there is a clear storage button or clear site data. So if you're going to want to click that a lot. There's also under the service workers, you can say update on reload. and Slot will make sure it gets a new version of that and doesn't do as much caching, but that's why we turn PWAs off by default with JHipster. So if we cleared the site data and then refresh, right, it's not actually there. So let's see if the registry is up, 8761, oops. So this one's up. And if I click sign in, it actually takes me to Okta, right? So instead of Keycloak, I configured it to go to Okta instead. I don't think this is my right password, but we'll try it. Nope. I keep all my passwords in one password, but I still have to get that password right. And copy that one. So you do have to have an administrator role, and I did do some setup on Okta beforehand to put people in, regular users and groups, as well as set up a group claim. And you can see we're logged in now, so the blog and the store are up. That gateway is giving us fits again, but we're using OAuth, right? So that's cool. And then what's another one? The Elk stack. So on 5601 is the JHipster console. And so this is aggregating all the logs from the different microservices together. So you can see them all in one place. And we basically pre-populate it with a number of dashboards that you can use that kind of visualize your microservices architecture. And this has to be like a Zoom thing because it usually comes up right away. We can also look at our Docker containers. And so this is something you're going to want to do. By default, how Docker is set up, if you actually run this demo, I think it gives like 2 gigs of space, and I have it up to 10 and like 6 CPUs. So you're going to want to bump stuff up. If I had bumped it up to like 20 out of 32, this actually might be working a little better. But yeah, if you go to resources here, you can see I have 6 CPUs, 12 gigs, and swap in the disk image and all that. So you want to bump those up, and the demo works better when you do. So we can see our dashboards here, and these are all the ones that we imported. JHipster did this for me when I started up and said I wanted to use JHipster console. It looks like it hasn't quite got anything. We could look at the log trail though and see the aggregated logs of all the microservices. Oh, they haven't made it there yet either. What if we look at the dashboard here and see if that gateway started up? It does prevent some services from starting before others. So for instance, the Postgres database has to be up first. And so the gateway is usually one of the last ones to start. And then I'll give this like a minute and then I'll give up. Don't worry.
Matt, we've got a question from the floor. Have you considered adding more backend frameworks next to Spring, like I think it's Micronauts, Helidon, and Quarkus?
So we have Micronaut and we have Quarkus. The Quarkus support just came out today. It's like alpha mode. Micronaut have actually been testing it. That one's actually pretty good. If you were to do an OAuth demo and create a basic monolith, I've run through that and proved that that works. There's also even .NET and Node.js. So there's a lot of backend support besides just Spring Boot. And that's why we've changed some of our nomenclature on our website to not say Spring Boot as much, because we want to give credit to these other folks that are developing these backends. So now we're at localhost 8080. If we click sign in, it'll redirect to Okta. And since I already logged into the registry, I'm already logged in, right? That's the beauty of single sign-on. So then obviously I could go and see the product I entered earlier. Because we're using MongoDB and there's a Docker container, it should have that same data if I didn't delete it. I have seen this issue with Zool, and usually a refresh solves it. So obviously that's not how you want to go to production, but it does seem to work. So I'm not sure why that happens, but whenever I've seen it, it can go away pretty easily. So yeah, that's the demo showing it all works. So I'm glad that didn't fail. So thank you for coming today. You can keep in touch with me on raibledesigns.com. That's my website. And then follow me on Twitter. My direct messages are wide open. So if you did want to send me a message, happy to answer any questions there. I will upload this presentation to SpeakerDeck shortly after this. And then a lot of the code I write is on Okta Developer. So we will have time for questions. But if you don't have any, may the auth be with you.
Any questions?
So obviously, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Much appreciated. Thank you, Matt, for your time. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I hope everyone else did. We'll be popping it up onto our YouTube, so you'll be able to all watch on there, and we'll be sending a copy of it around as well, so you've all got access to that. In terms of our next events, so we're going to try and do them every month, just kind of as we usually would. So yeah, just keep an eye on our website, ioassociates.co.uk, and the Meetup page as well. I think that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening, y'all, or the rest of your day, depending on where you're from. And
Thank you very much, Matt. You too.
Thank you, Matt. That was brilliant.